I'm going to give a very, very kind of raw new piece of thinking today, and I'll introduce everybody in the course of the paper, but I am going to be working today with my co-researchers here from the Brown Trinity MFA program. So I'm going to start, for the sake of time, and read and do the introductions as we go. So as I think it's been clear a little bit, certainly from the work shown today and the work of Jennifer Baker, right? Amongst others, the relationship between theater and debt is an intense one at the dramaturgical and practical level. Dramaturgical meditations on debt are present throughout dramatic literature, from the early modern to the present, and while it might be productive to think across all of dramatic literature in a way parallel to David Graeber and sort of a very long history of debt, I'm opting instead to think alongside what I would call the development of Anglo-liberalism and later the financialization emergent from UChicago economics as they develop and ultimately transform U.S. capitalism and British capitalism, but today in particular, I want to speak briefly about their incursion into Chile. I think what I'm asking here is, this paper is sort of the beginning of what I think of as kind of a longer argument with Raymond Williams' theorization and framing of modern tragedy. And while he does talk about debt, I think my big question is the history of the modern tragedy in fact the history of negotiation with debt? And so this is a field I don't usually play in, so I think you can tell by the titles of my books, I'm usually playing much more in Latin America and with Latinx playwrights and writers and cultural producers. But I think this is sort of my attempt to think through a certain genealogy of sort of Anglo-European theater history that I often teach, but in relationship to this larger question of what debt does, and sort of to do a large historical sweep. So this is never something I do, but I'm going to try today. So, the work that I'm trying to do here is awfully complementary of Williams and of the work of David Savrin and a number of sort of Marxist literary theorists, but it also, I think, I want to call out a book that often gets forgotten, which is a book called Worlds Apart by Christophe Agnew, which is also really important to thinking, although he's dealing with an earlier period, so I'm not going to touch the period he touches for that reason. And I want to start with what I think of as a really kind of a confused terrain dramaturgically in the 18th and 19th century. So it's to think about how some of the transformations that we think about in terms of the ones that Graeber talks about in terms of debt, but other theorists too, come to play at the edges of dramas seen as canonical to framing middle-class heroes and sort of the history of dramatic literature. So I'm going to sort of talk about how I'm going to move through this. The first play I want to acknowledge is George Lillo's infamous and transformative London Merchant from 1731. That really does take on sort of the age of capitalist empires in an incredible way. And in a more overtly gendered way, I would say, than a lot of theorizations of debt that we read. I'm going to briefly go to Hebel's Maria Magdalena, which was a really important influence for Ibsen, and I would argue a really important text to think about Doll's House, actually. And all of these plays, and the reason I call them confused, is that they toggle between social and economic forms of debt, and the languages get very imbricated in each other. And then I'm going to move to Doll's House, which is Ibsen, and Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, sort of just to complete this sort of arc of the middle-class tragedy that we inherit. And then I'm going to move on to the issue of educational debt, which comes up in an interesting way in young Jean Lee's work, Straight White Men, which was recently put on Broadway. And I will say that she's, very consciously thinking about this genealogy, but I think it's worth saying that this is the first the first play written by an Asian American woman on Broadway, and it happens to be a play about straight white men, and I'm just going to leave that there and come back to it. And then I'm going to take a sort of a coda to look at Chile and move a little bit out of what I would think of as as tragedies into a more performative mode, gesturing to some performance poetry, and if we have time, the restaging of Michael Jackson's Thriller by students in Santiago who were protesting student debt. And that's all to say that I'm going to try to think through this sort of drama, what I would call these sort of dramaturgies of debt and their psychic tolls in a number of different ways. And I'm doing this today with my co-researchers, and that term, why I'm using that term, is going to be apparent over the course of this talk. For MFA actors in their second year at Brown Trinity, Kalyne Coleman, Michael Rosas, Jack Dryden, and Caitlin Duffy, who are going to be acting/reading short scenes from the text that I am going to mention today. And I also want to nod to Peter, because an early idea Peter and I had, which has transformed in a different way, was actually to think of a way to intersperse this conference with readings of literature about debt by actors, but I've kind of incorporated that into what I think of as a sketch of a book project that awaits a well-deserved sabbatical, if I must say so myself. So I'm going to start with The London Merchant. The London Merchant has often been understood as a didactic play that extolled the class of London merchants, while underscoring the importance of honest, transparent, homosocial relations between men for the success of the new economy. Told through the frame of a story of an apprentice gone astray, falling prey to a grifter and a keeper of a house of entertainments, a woman named Millwood. For those of you who love the 18th century drama, you know it's significant that Millwood is referred to by her last name and not her first name in this play. And she extracts money from Barnwell, this young apprentice merchant, eventually convincing him to kill his uncle. He eventually repents over the course of the play, and she does not, instead pointing to the gendered relations of contemporary life. And this play, while it's thought of as this very didactic play that sort of talks about the virtue of merchants, as Lisa Friedman has so powerfully argued, is also the story of a relationship between sort of colonial modes of plunder and extraction that live underneath this new mode of capitalism. And all of those sort of anxieties about colonialism are notably projected onto the female characters in this play. So at this point, I'm going to ask that we hear the first excerpt from The London Merchant, in which Millwood speaks to her confidant, Lucy.
How do I look today, Lucy?
Oh, killingly, madam. A little more red and you'll be irresistible. But why this more than ordinary care of your dress and complexion? What new conquest are you aiming at?
A conquest would be new indeed.
Not to you, who make 'em every day. But to me, well, 'tis what I'm never to expect, unfortunate as I am. But your wit and beauty...
First made me a wretch, and still continue me so. Men, however generous or sincere to one another, are all selfish hypocrites in their affairs with us. We are no otherwise esteemed or regarded by them, but as we contribute to their satisfaction.
You are certainly, madam, on the wrong side in this argument. Is not the expense all theirs? And I am sure it is our own fault if we haven't our share of the pleasure.
We are but slaves to men.
Nay, 'tis they that are slaves most certainly, for we lay them under contribution.
Slaves have no property. No, not even in themselves. All is the victor's.
You are strangely arbitrary in your principles, madam.
I would have my conquest complete, like those of the Spaniards in the New World, who first plundered the natives of all the wealth they had, and then condemned the natives of all the wealth, I would have my conquest complete, like those of the Spaniards in the New World, who first plundered the natives of all the wealth they had, and then condemned the wretches to the mines for life to work for more.
Well, I shall never approve of your scheme of government. I should think it much more politic, as well as just, to find my subjects an easier employment.
It's a general maxim among the knowing part of mankind that a woman without virtue, like a man without honor or honesty, is capable of any action, though never so vile. And yet, what pains will they not take? What arts not use to seduce us from our innocence and make us contemptible and wicked, even in their own opinions? Then, Is it not just the villains, to their cost, should find us so? But guilt makes them suspicious and keeps them on their guard. Therefore, we can take advantage only of the young and innocent part of the sex who, having never injured woman, apprehend no injury from them.
Aye, they must be young indeed.
Great, thank you. So clearly here the link between conquest and capitalism and colonialism is made clear, as well as the sort of gendered effects of that regime. But there's also a link to debt in this play, and it's often ignored. And so although this isn't really a play about debt, there's a curious remark that places the issue of debt and default into the system. And I think if we're to take Millwood seriously, we can't discount the larger truth of her past, even though it seems that she's actually inventing it, to seduce Barnwell. So I'm going to send you to the next piece.
Aye. The barbarous man is rich enough, but what are riches when compared to love?
For a while, he performed the office of a faithful guardian, settled her in a house, hired her servants. But you've seen in what manner she lived, so I need say no more of that.
How shall I live hereafter? Heaven knows.
All things went on as one could wish, till, some time ago, his wife dying, he fell violently in love with his charge, and would fain have married her. Now the man is neither old nor ugly, but a good personable sort of man. But I don't know how it was she could never endure him. In short, her ill usage so provoked him that he brought in an account of his executorship, wherein he makes her debtor to him.
A trifle in itself, but more than enough to ruin me, whom by this unjust account he had stripped all of before.
Now, she having neither money nor friend, except me, who am as fortunate as herself, he compelled her to pass his account and give bond for the sum he demanded, but still provided handsomely for her and continued his courtship, till being informed by his spies, truly I suspect some in her own family, that you were entertained at her house and stayed with her all night. He came this morning raving and storming like a madman, talks no more of marriage, so there's no hopes of making matters up that way, but vows her ruin, unless she'll allow him the same favor that he supposes she granted you.
So what's interesting here is, even though it's not a play about debt, clearly there's a fictionalized debt being put forth. And so I guess I would ask the question then how does the debt affect Millwood, and how does the question of debt relate to the history of speculation that surrounds the play? And given that this play was not written long after the South Seas bubble, a fact that the audience would have known and could have possibly related to Millwood's situation, despite the rather oblique reference. And the idea, of course, from the footnote, right, is that she's suggesting that the guardian forced her to approve withdrawals that sort of robbed her twice. If we can't answer these questions, even given that we think Millwood might be fibbing, we still have work to do to understand how the issue of debt and sort of speculation and potentially mismanagement are at the heart of understanding the emergence of the middle-class tragedy in English. And so there's an intertext here, Maria Magdalena by Hebel, which is often sort of read as a prologue to what Raymond Williams would call the liberal tragedy. But like the London Merchant, the play is thought of as a middle-class tragedy which laments a shifting in social mores. And in it, a young woman who becomes pregnant with a child from a suitor kills herself to retain the virtue of her middle-class family after he abandons her, after learning that she doesn't have a dowry. And what it ends up, the plot point is that the reason she doesn't have a dowry is because her father's actually paid off the debt of his former master. And so he has a moment where he explains this, and he says, a month ago, I'll tell you today what the suitor who is pursuing his daughter says, what happened to the money? And he says, now you know where the money is. I can tell you today because my old master was buried yesterday. A month ago, I've kept it to myself on my deathbed. I put the IOU under the dead man's head before they nailed up his coffin. If I could write, I would have put honorably paid at the bottom, but all I could do in my ignorance was tear the paper lengthwise. Now we will sleep in peace, and I shall, and peace, and as I shall when I stretch myself out by him someday. And so I guess my point here is twofold, is that there's a confusion and conflation between social, religious, and monetary debt in this work, despite its sort of modes of abstraction and the fact that it's using this language of the IOU. And second, that the specter of debt is always haunting the emergence of the modern tragedy, especially the emergence of the liberal hero in that modern tragedy. So the IOU stands to convert a sort of a psychic debt to its material and mundane form, gesturing to but not entirely contained by the idea of spiritual debt. And again, this is a play that Ibsen supposedly knew by heart and would kind of recite sections of in his everyday life. And so that's sort of the prologue to thinking Williams and his relationship to the assessment of Ibsen's sort of liberal tragedy, in which aspiration is also always linked to debt. Williams is quick to point out that debt is not sin in Ibsen's conception. He states, quote, "The debts that count in bringing his heroes down are incurred in the struggle for life and light, however wayward this is often shown to be." In fact, in that 1966 classic, Williams describes the liberal tragedy as one where, quote, "The individual refused the role of the victim and became a new kind of hero. The heroism is not in the nobility of suffering as the limits were reached. It was now unambiguously in the aspiration itself." And coming to fruition under Ibsen and industrial capitalism, the individual hero of the liberal tragedy aspires to self-fulfillment that refuses to compromise with the sort of quote-unquote false society and is thus destroyed, quote, in his attempt to crawl out of the partial world, unquote, converting from hero to martyr. So Ibsen's dramaturgy, according to Williams, pairs the tragedy of aspiration with the concept of debt, which can be contracted in the act of the refusal of compromise, or perhaps as simply a happenstance from being a part of the world that he struggles against. So as Williams points out, debt can't be defined simply as inheritance of original sin or pure monetary debt, but that Ibsen's characters, even though they often do have literal debt, which a point I'll return to, and are working in a world that advocates capital accumulation to create social prosperity. But the characters are not fully defined by market rationality. In fact, these market values contrast with the moral and political realm that exists outside. Given the agonistic structure of these plays, Ibsen's heroes always resist these calculations on some level. In contrast, he reads Death of a Salesman's Willy Loman, in contrast to that, as, quote, "A man who goes from selling things, who from selling things has passed to selling himself and has in effect become a commodity like all other commodities, which will at a certain point be discarded by the laws of the economy. He brings tragedy down on himself, not by opposing the lie, but by living it." And so that's the distinction he's making between Ibsen and Williams. And we can talk about how that relates to consumer capitalism as well. So charting the change from industrial capitalism to consumer capitalism, Miller's liberal tragedy realigns Ibsen's conceptions of aspiration and debt. And these changing conceptions, I would argue, although Williams does not, are particular to differential modes of self-making at different moments in capitalism in the US and Europe. What Williams doesn't fully attend to is how crucial monetary debts are to the structure and contents of Ibsen's drama, particularly A Doll's House, and nor does he discuss in his assessment of it in the way that he talks about Death of a Salesman. So A Doll's House comes first. Most scholars consider the play to be a meditation on Nora's gaining independence from a sham marriage. But the plot revolves around a debt and the need to repay it. The play itself preaches about debt in the very first scene when assessing Nora's spending habits. So here we go.
Oh, but Torvald, this year we really should let ourselves go a bit. It's the first Christmas we haven't had to economize.
But you know we can't go squandering.
Oh yes, Torvald, we can squander a little now, can't we? Just a tiny, wee bit. Now that you've got a big salary and are gonna make piles and piles of money.
Yes. Starting on New Year's. But then it's a full 3 months till the raise comes through.
Pooh, we can borrow that long.
Nora, are your scatterbrains off again? What if today I borrowed 1,000 crowns and you squandered them over Christmas week? And then on New Year's Eve, a roof tile falls on my head and I lay there just...
Don't say such things.
Yes, but what if it happened? Then what?
If anything so awful happened, then it just wouldn't matter if I had debts or not.
Well, but the people I borrowed from?
Them? Who cares about them? They're strangers.
Nora, how like a woman. No, but seriously, Nora, you know what I think about that. No debts, no borrow. Something of freedom's lost, and something of beauty too, from a home that's founded on borrowing and debt. We've made a brave stand up to now, the two of us, and we'll go on right on like that the little while we have to.
Yes, Whatever you say, Torvald.
Great. And so it switches, and she has that conversation, and then just a little bit later in the play, she has a conversation with Mrs. Lind where she extrapolates a little bit more about the nature of this debt. So let's go to Doll's House 2.
Now listen here, Nora. You haven't done something indiscreet.
Is it indiscreet to save your husband's life?
I think it's indiscreet that without his knowledge, you...
But that's the point. He mustn't know. My lord, can't you understand? He mustn't ever know the close call he had. It was to me. The doctors came to say his life was in danger, that nothing could save him but a stay in the South. Didn't I try strategy then? I began talking about how lovely it would be for me to travel abroad like other wives. I begged and I cried. I told him please to remember my condition, to be kind and indulge me. And then I dropped a hint that he could easily take out a loan. But at that, Christine, he nearly exploded. He said I was frivolous, and it was his duty as a man of the house not to indulge me in whims and fancies, as I think he called them. I thought, now you'll just have to be saved. And that's when I saw my chance.
And your father never told Torvald the money wasn't from him?
No, never. Papa died right about then. I considered bringing him into my secret and begging him never to tell, but he was too sick at the time. And then sadly, it didn't matter.
And you've never confided in your husband since?
For heaven's sake, no! Are you serious? He's so strict on that subject. Besides, Torvald, with all his masculine pride, how painfully humiliating for him if he ever found out he was in debt to me. That would just ruin our relationship. Our beautiful, happy home would never be the same.
Won't you ever tell him?
Yes, maybe, sometime, years from now, when I'm no longer so attractive. Don't laugh. I only mean when Torvald loves me less than now, when he stops enjoying my dancing and dressing up and reciting for him. Then it might be wise to have something in reserve. How ridiculous. That'll never happen. Well, Christine, what do you think of my big secret? I'm capable of something too. You can imagine, of course, how this thing hangs over me. It really hasn't been easy meeting the payments on time. In the business world, there's what they call quarterly interest and what they call amortization. And these are always so terribly hard to manage. I've had to skimp a little here and there, wherever I could, you know. I could hardly spare anything from my house allowance because Torvald has to live well. I couldn't let the children go poorly dressed. Whatever I got for them, I felt I had to use up completely. The darlings.
Great, thank you. So my point here is just to think about Nora as a sort of a liberal heroine of A Doll's House, something I'm certainly pushing harder than Williams. Then we have to think about debt as well as the escape from patriarchy, and that those two things are actually really embedded in each other in this play. So I'm going to skip to Death of a Salesman and try to go through this a little bit quickly. For those of you who know the play, it's a canonical U.S. drama, and what Williams does to it, and Savrin to a different extent, is really thinking about the change in consumer capitalism and sort of how the middle class hero of consumer capitalism is different in some ways from Ibsen, and that the subjectivity is created in a slightly different way, and how it relates to masculinity. And so thus is sort of making a claim about how consumer capitalism's reliance on selling consumable products overtakes the value of masculine practical knowledge, charisma, and independent spirit. Yet the aspiration to consume so as to keep the U.S. economy afloat in the post-World War years, sort of on World War II and right after, encourages the emergence of the self as a consumer, realigning the relationship between aspiration and debt with a different set of material conditions in the mid-20th century. Yet reading Salesman today, one is shocked by how often monetary debt is mentioned, compounding its critiques on shifts in labor and work. And early in the play, we learn how much Willie and Linda owe on their insurance policy, on their washing machine, and their mortgage, in a litany of the scene.
Oh, the whole block will be at that game. Did you sell anything?
I did 500 gross in Providence and 700 gross in Boston.
No. Wait a minute, I've got a pencil. That makes your commission $200. My God, $212.
Well, I didn't figure it yet, but...
Well, how much did you do?
Well, I did about 180 gross in Providence. No, it came to roughly 200 gross on the whole trip.
200 gross, that's...
The trouble was that 3 of the stores were half closed for inventory in Boston. Otherwise, I would have broke records.
Well, it makes $70 and some pennies. That's very good.
What do we owe?
Well, on the first, there's $16 on the refrigerator.
Why 16?
Well, the fan belt broke, so it was $1.80.
But it's brand new.
Well, the man said that's the way it is, till they work themselves in, you know?
I hope we didn't get stuck on that machine.
They got the biggest ads of any of them.
I know it's a fine machine. What else?
Well, there's $9.60 for the washing machine, and for the vacuum cleaner, there's $3.50 due on the 15th. Then the roof, you got $21 remaining.
It don't leak, does it?
No, they did a wonderful job. Then you owe Frank for the carburetor.
I'm not going to pay that man. That goddamn Chevrolet, they ought to prohibit the manufacture of that car.
Well, you owe him $3.50. And odds and ends comes to around $120 by the 15th.
Well, $120? My God. If business don't pick up, I don't know what I'm gonna do.
Well, next week you'll do better.
Oh, I'll knock 'em dead next week. I'll go to Hartford. I'm very well liked in Hartford. You know, the trouble is, Linda, people don't seem to take to me.
Great, thank you. So obviously the nature of debt as a daily installment rather than a one-time sacrifice speaks to the diversification of risk here in terms of thinking insurance. But what I think is interesting is at the end of the play, right, we think of this as a tragedy of sort of a certain kind of masculinity dying, but what Linda says, I think, is actually really important. So it's just a tiny little piece.
I can't understand it. At this time, especially. First time in 35 years, we were just about free and clear. He only needed a little salary. He was even finished with a dentist.
Thank you. So it's interesting that Linda thinks that the end of debt is sort of the end of his feeling of precarity, or that would affect his psyche, and it's later proved that that's not really it, but the fact that there's always a female character who's often sidelined in this play, literally sort of like almost like a ledger of talking about debt, I think is something that needs to be accounted for more clearly. So, you know, as I think about this, right, if you know the play, it's also he's like seemingly in this moment of precarity because eventually, because he's not a good salesman, he's asked to only work on commission and not have a salary, which I also think is important. But in thinking about this relationship of the development of the middle class tragedy to sort of American capitalism, I think we have to take debt into account more fully. And so even as he becomes sort of, for Savrin, a sort of an anti-exemplar of aspiration, there's still this sort of tangled piece about debt we can't completely undo. So the relationship between his sort of anti-aspirational aspiration debt is trickier in young Jean Lee's straight white men. And this is really where I began the project, is thinking a little bit about this play as its debt to the sort of lineage of drama, but also how it differently thinks about debt because it's primarily thinking about educational debt. So Lee's play centers on a Christmas gathering of a father, Ed, and his 3 sons, Jake, Drew, and Matt, who have varying degrees of success in their lives. And obviously this is her meditation on straight white male dramaturgy, as she calls it. And it's often thought of as really a play about privilege, but I also think it's a play about debt. It had a workshop here at Brown in I think 2012, 2013. And today, rather than dealing with the aspect of privilege, I want to deal with how debt works here. And I think I argue that this is a play about the psychic experience of debt as much as it is a struggle to think about white privilege and masculinity. Young's play clearly harkens back to Dollhouse and Salesman in a number of ways. She deals with familial inheritance. The first scene of the play is a Christmas scene, just like A Doll's House. And it has a sort of a thrifty father and adult sons rather than this female spendthrift. And the exploration of the unhappiness of a set of male sons obviously sort of gestures to death of a salesman. But unlike Ibsen and Miller's plays, in her play there's no familial event that conditions Matt's failure or demise. Instead, the play kind of ironizes the idea that there's some psychic piece that he's rectifying. And we're left to believe that the primal scene, if there is one, is Matt's experience as a straight white male in a liberal arts college where he was like called on his privilege and thus kind of falls apart. However, he also has a lot of debt, which is what I want to talk about. And so there's a moment in the play where Jake, who is one of the brothers, says, Matt's a freak. I mean, all those years of banging his head against the wall as a community organizer and not letting Dad pay off any of his student loans. All that debt and nothing to show for it. And so Matt is back living in his father's basement, like hanging out and helping his aging father. But the point here is if Matt took all of those loans, one would assume he did not have the familial money not to have to take loans. Yet there's a suggestion that his father could have helped or perhaps paid them off. Given the age of the characters and the loan policies therein, it seems likely that the bulk of his debt came from graduate and professional school rather than from his undergraduate loans. The character has a PhD in Russian studies and a law degree. And if this is true, unless Ed was extraordinarily wealthy or an especially good investor, paying them off would have been impossible without him kind of liquidating his retirement nest egg or his home, an issue this first version of the play is pretty oblique about referencing. Yet the play does reveal how we're to think about these loans. Jake frames educational debt as individualized risk management, all that debt and nothing to show for it. This frame, of course, is a neoliberal mode of valuation, which alongside Matt's role as a liberal hero in Ibsen's sense, so I think this is something that Lee's really struggling with and thinking through, makes him culpable for his situation. Matt's culpability makes his assumption of monetary debt a psychological problem rather than an economic reality, inverting a more plausible relationship of cause and effect. Watching the play, I asked myself, might Matt's inability to cope be an effect of his debt rather than its cause? Is this why Ed, his father, is so angry that he's made a quote-unquote bad investment? And if you try to calculate Matt's debt, it's really overwhelming. Although it's not quantified in the play, his loans were estimated in rehearsal as hundreds of thousands of dollars. The question remains, for me at least, is what remains of debt and how does this debt affect his psyche? Is this the reason he moved home? Is he trying to dig himself out of debt while he helps his aging father by being useful? If we consider that Matt is 44 in the play and spent 13 years in school, he would have entered the academic market or the legal market at a time even when, if he'd finished his degrees, he may have been in a precarious state. By the turn of the 21st century, the widespread hiring of adjuncts and decline in tenure-track jobs in the academy, particularly in language departments, I think it's striking that he has a language PhD, may have precluded a more sustainable career in the academy, and by the time he was out of law school, the financial crash would have laid him off before he ascended the ranks of a firm, and I know a number of people who went to law school later and are actually in this predicament. Materially, Matt's life is precarious because he joined the labor force 15 years or so later than his brothers, after a huge shift in the occupational possibilities for white-collar workers with legal and academic degrees. That he tempts is not out of the realm of possibility for someone with his skill set, despite his level of ambition or self-worth. That Matt's failure is then less an issue of self-esteem than a reaction to historical consequence. His malaise at the situation is also historical and social, mirroring the affective state of indebtedness so widespread amongst the first world precariat. Matt's precarity comes not from being exhausted under the grind of consumer capitalism a la Willy Loman, but from being crushed under the financialization of educational debt as a mode of self-appreciation. My emphasis on debt here, although it's not a major player in the first production of the script I saw, was a plot in earlier drafts, and Matt has a choice to have his father pay off the debt. That's the way Lee originally wrote it, and then the students were so, that she worked with on the workshop they thought it was so ridiculous that he wouldn't just let his father pay his debt. She thought it was dramaturgically unfeasible to leave that aspect of the plot, and she changed it. But I do think it's still sort of a ghostly presence in the version of the play about privilege. So after this, I interviewed young Jean Lee, and then she rewrote the play and brought debt back into the play, actually, and made it a very important plot point. In fact, the check Matt's father, Ed, writes to pay off his debt is conspicuously placed on stage by a stagehand in a transition between scenes in such a way that it calls great attention of the audience. The prop then almost becomes like an erratic object that gestures to Ibsen's use of notes, letters, calling cards, and paper notes, and their revelation as major plot points. Yet in Lee's hands, the stage business pushes these objects outside of traditional realism through the meta-theatrical trick of visible stagehands, who she specifies should be people of color, incidentally, and they just sort of drop them on stage. In the most recent version on Broadway, that was cut, but the following scene still remains at the end of the play, so we all go to straight white men.
Matt, you gotta help me out here. I'm not gonna watch you destroy your life. I've been enabling you for too long. I'm not gonna do it. If you won't agree to make some honest attempt to improve your life, I'm done, man. I can't have any more contact with you.
Drew,
No,
please.
no. I just promise me you're gonna take one positive step. I'll do everything in my power to help you.
I can't do that.
You would choose staying in this situation over having a relationship with me? Okay. Enjoy your misery.
Matt, here's what we need to do. You're gonna take this, you're gonna pay off your loans. You have so much potential. Go out there and change the
I
world.
can't take your money, Dad.
Yes, you can.
I didn't earn it.
What does it matter if you earn the money or not? Take the check.
I don't want it.
Matt, what is wrong with you?
Nothing's wrong, Dad. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel bad about what I'm doing. I feel useful.
What you're doing isn't actually useful, especially considering everything that's been invested in you. You should be doing more than cooking and cleaning like a housemaid.
I want to be here.
It's repugnant, Matt. There's something repugnant about it. I wonder what your mother would say if she were here.
Awesome, thank you. So it's clear that the sort of perniciousness of educational debt gets wrapped into a very particular kind of financializing discourse by the family. And I guess my point here is that that sort of malaise that Matt has and his feeling of being useful is a sort of a different labor model than the one in which is supposed to be enacting aspiration and sort of refuses. And that sort of refusal of aspiration is interesting in terms of thinking the legacy of Ibsen or moving away from it simultaneously. So I think I'm gonna run short on time, so I want to conclude to talk about this issue of student debt, and particularly with the students who came as my co-researchers to help me deliver this paper today. So I think it's really clear that the perniciousness of educational debt as personal investment and responsibility makes students, quote unquote, behave as if they were individual businesses in the play. But I think this is anything but play acting. Thus here I turn to how the very privatization of educational debt erases the idea of education as a public good for arts students. This formulation is especially present in graduate theater arts education, where these degrees are misrecognized as an individuated form of acquiring virtuosity and professional connections. I navigated this terrain when working as a chair to advocate for better financial aid practices for the Brown Trinity program, and its now tuition-free acting and debt-free directing degrees. This is a seeming tangent, thank you, and to all of them, for my dramaturgical analyses above, but it is actually part of the same problem for me. I want to think through how this issue briefly in relation to the idea of professional training, which I think is a misnomer when talking about the arts, which is why I introduced the actors here today as co-researchers rather than actors, although they are also actors. And although I have paid them on an actor's scale, a union scale, to be here today, and I did not ask them to volunteer their time, although admittedly that money came from my research account, so it is a mixed economy. So here's the problem. Professional training, as opposed to, say, graduate training in a research field, i.e. the PhD, is assumed to be an investment model in which you pay out of pocket to receive individual skills that help you succeed in your career such that you as an individual gain promotion and or monetary gain. So that's the model for a business school or a law school or a number of other professional programs. This is seemingly opposed to how institutions think about funding, quote unquote, pure research as a societal good. But is this really a true distinction, especially when degrees are embedded within research institutions with a strong commitment to liberal arts education? Certainly, MFA degrees in theater are designed such that students acquire very specific creative skills, including embodied techniques of expression, but they often develop these skills while obtaining an affective and intellectual expansiveness that adds to society as a whole as much as it does to gaining personal capital in arts markets. MFAs do professionalize, i.e., they can make one a better artist, connect students to professionals, give a pedigree, and all of those things, and qualify degree recipients to teach. The MFA is a terminal degree. But this does not necessarily translate into monetary profit generation, and thus lies the problem. Schools of professional studies and professional schools and extension programs like Harvard's, which famously canceled its certificate graduate degree last year after they were cited for a few years ago after they were cited for predatory lending by the Obama administration. are largely designed to create revenue by offering non-degree or professional degree programs for an instrumentalized purpose. This makes no sense for the arts. Although not everyone places debt politics at the forefront of their thinking, the fact that MFA degrees are only rarely funded in private institutions is not just the bad faith of universities. To be fair, there's little or no claim to private or public research money for, i.e. Mellon, NSF, et cetera, for institutional support of MFA programs, even innovative ones, or direct financial support for students seeking those degrees. One of the only avenues for this kind of support, the Jack Cook Kent Scholarship, no longer provides funding for MFA students. Professional partners, i.e. not-for-profit theater companies, can't make up the financial difference either. Yet the proximity of MFA, PhD, and BA students and the very different compensation and value of their labor is striking and mobilizing. Collaboration, while often glorious, throws these disparities into relief, and the reaction to this inequality often ends with personalized attacks rather than systemic solutions. Which understanding to the reality of faculty, student, and yes, administrators' labor as part of these structures is nearly nil. Explaining things is admittedly cold comfort when you have to have a loan just to eat as you're shuttling between classes and rehearsals in your 16-hour day. This is a very type of day that makes earning money at a work-study job while completing a degree impossible. This laboring reality, of course, is different from those experienced by fully funded research PhD students who aren't always completely taken care of but are treated better than MFA students in most cases, or by undergraduates at elite institutions. This kind of disparity and misunderstanding of disparity is toxic, leading to rage, tears, and sadness among students, faculty, and staff alike. The problem, to my mind, is simple: a profound misunderstanding of arts labor. Despite a number of investments in debt-free MFA education here at Brown, many of the larger ideological and structural issues of the MFA are not so easily solved in the neoliberal university, even one with more protections than most places enjoy. Practically speaking, we could argue that these degrees do not sit on one side of the research professionalization binary, and thus should be funded like research degrees because students produce knowledge. We need to theorize the MFA degree such that we understand that teaching people how to make art that produces knowledge and models a way of thinking, is a basic goal of graduate arts education, from the most fundamental voice exercise to the final production and evaluation. If this is true, then it is a society articulated broadly that is indebted to the emergence of these artists, and thus it's the responsibility of research institutions and its supporters, not the individual artists, to take on the cost of that education. I think this shift would be transformative also for students' psyches. Taking a turn away from Ibsen, we must disperse responsibility away from a hero who stands up to a false society and send our debt back to a social body, letting go of our idea of the artist as an iconoclastic hero and a harborer of crushing debt who sacrifices himself to expose society's foibles and violence. Instead, we should realize that the artist in debt accrues to us all. So I'm going to quit talking here, but I wanted to honor Michael, who I asked to read a really interesting performance poem by Cecilia Vicuna, actually, and I'm just going to have him read that, and then maybe we can just, I'll just end.
Yeah.
So thank you.
A message came. It says, Waikapuro Guatemo had been speaking to the European community on February the 8th, 02. He said, Usura, brothers, you who ask us to pay you our debt, you are asking to pay you our debt. In reality, I loaned you millions and millions and millions and millones of gold and silver as a friendly gesture of the Americas towards the development of Europe. This was our Marshall Tesuma plan for the reconstruction of the barbaric Europe. Poor them. But it failed. Look, in its irrational, capitalistic ways, they are still at it. Europe always wants more. They need more from us. Up. To return to us, to return to us the gold and silver we so generously loaned. We ask you to now sign a letter of intent as a way to discipline you. And then I wanted to tell you, after your September 11th, which is my second September 11th, I decided to go to BA, that's Buenos Aires, to take a little refuge. Look at the refuge I picked, huh? I was there. And even a few weeks before the whole thing started, I was scribbling down these notes that were perhaps in everybody's minds, about the deuda. You know what the deuda is. The deuda is the debt, the so-called debt. If you go now to the drawing center, you will find a little scrap of paper that Ellsworth Kelly took to make a little drawing. In it, you will see a little ad from the New York Times. It says, Argentina says it's going to pay the debt. 1959. La deudita. If you open the word deuda in Spanish, it becomes deuda. De from da. Give. You can also read it in Portuñol, that's the future language of South America, and it becomes God gives deuda. Turn around the U in a U-turn, turned inside out, the
Thank you.